What happens when you take a game that is reasonably successful, trim out the fat, give it a generous seasoning of salt and pepper, and cook it just right for the absolute best tenderness? You get Zone of the Enders, the second runner. Zone of the Enders released in 2001 for the PlayStation 2 and it was a mild success, but it's arguable as to what that success could really be attributed to. Some may argue that it's the game itself, while others, myself included, argue it's the inclusion of a demo for Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty. That's what made it sell as many copies as it did as far as I'm concerned. On its own, it managed to create a very smooth gameplay experience with mecha action at the forefront. Plenty of other games of the era struggled to make mecha action smooth to play, with some exceptions, but for the most part Zone of the Enders handled its core game design very well. However, there were a few problems along the way. Some of the design decisions were not quite as well received, and if you've seen the previous episode, you'll know that I'm not a fan of how the game padded out its length. After the release of Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty in 2001, plans for a sequel to the original Zone of the Enders would start to take shape, although the game's open ending was just that. There were no intentions of providing genuine closure. In May 2002, a sequel was announced and the staff at the head of the project were switched around from before. Whilst the names of Hideo Kojima, Yoji Shinkawa, Nobuyoshi Nishimura and Shuyo Murata would stay on, the original game's director, Noriaki Okamura, would have his credit reduced to special thanks. Shuyo Murata would take Okamura's mantle as the director, with Kojima again serving as producer. The intention above anything else in developing this game was to solve some of the problems with the original game, whilst allowing for the switch around to facilitate a new spin on the original formula. Zone of the Enders, the second runner, would release in Japan on the 13th of February 2003 as Anubis Zone of the Enders, with America seeing it 1 month later on the 10th of March, whilst Europe would have to wait until the 26th of September before being able to play it. The game reviewed well, generally better than the original game, with a lot of the praise going towards the improvements made going from one game to another, as well as the graphics being better both stylistically and technically. Unfortunately, the game did not sell very well. It had to stand on its own 2 feet, as no other game was ready to serve as its saviour to make it more marketable, but it wasn't able to do so, but that's for later on. For now though, why don't we take a look at the game? The packaging for Zone of the Enders, the second runner is quite consistent across all regions, with a strong emphasis of a gold-orange colour encapsulating the front, with a human figure in the foreground, and several mechs dotting the cover with the logo towards the top and contrasted against the backdrop. Other regions will have the cover be slightly modified to have the logo brought down a bit, the top of the cover be black rather than orange, and have Hideo Kojima's signature be alongside the game's logo, rather than just having his name at the bottom. We look at the back to discover a slightly busier back cover in terms of what's on it. We see screenshots and an awful lot of words that I'd need to use a translator for, owing to how long the sentences are in a language that I can only really understand the more basic writing systems of. In the case is the game disc, and that's it. My copy doesn't even have a manual with it. Hell, this box isn't even really for this game, it's actually for a game called Gladiator Road to Freedom, if the bottom sticker is anything to go by on the back. The content of the game, however, does set you up well enough, and it being a sequel, most of what the previous games showed will still apply here, as we will see momentarily. So, enough dawdling, it's time to boot up the game and see how it stacks up against what came before it. Oh, and just like the previous game, I'm covering basically all of the games, so spoiler alert, that has been your warning. The game starts up with a sequence beginning with narration from an unseen individual with a gradually zooming out image of Mars. It then showcases a succession of cinematic sequences with gameplay segments woven in largely out of order and without context, with backing music that I want to talk about later, but for now, let's go. As before, we'll be playing on the normal difficulty, so once we've selected that, we are on the Jupiter moon of Callisto in the year 2174. Mining robots dig away at the walls of cliffs whilst we are coming into land. Our character, called Dingo Egret, add that to the list, picks up a reading on his robot's computer that there's Metatron nearby, so he goes to investigate, finding an unusual large box placed some distance away. He finds a massive robot, opening its cockpit hatch after touching it, and moments later, everything begins to explode around him as an invading force shows up. Dingo, aware that he's got very few options, decides to hop into the cockpit of this robot and is greeted by a rather friendly voice. Eventually, things explode to a point where the big metal box falls deep into a ravine before, rather mysteriously, a massive crater appears, and the orbital frame Jehuty bursts out of its packaging and straight into action with two enemies. Once we've beaten the enemies, we are introduced to Jehuty's AI, Ada, who thrusts us straight into a tutorial where we are once again acquainted with the game's controls, so let's go over them. The game controls in much the same way the original game did, with most of the buttons performing the same actions as they did previously, but some of the differences come down to it being more taut, quick and precise than the previous game. Included are a couple new features. Firstly, burst shots can be charged over time to increase their destructive power, at the cost of your own vulnerability. Dash shots also shoot out many more lasers than before, and holding the attack button before releasing allows you to target multiple enemies. The grabbing mechanic has also been modified with one major feature that will be such fun to mess with. Spamming the circle button when you've grabbed an enemy allows you to swing them around like an athlete at the hammer throw, and after a couple seconds, they'll be released and thrown into whatever surface or enemy you're looking at. The grabbing mechanic can also be used to pick things up in the environment to use either as a shield or as a weapon to swing or throw at an enemy. Camera and lock-on controls have also been modified to be less awkward. Holding the L2 button will disengage the lock-on, whilst pressing it will either engage it or switch to another target. Similarly, the right analog stick can be used to switch to another target of your choosing. Since for the most part the controls are the same as before but with some tweaks, we move on from the tutorial and are thrown into a cutscene featuring some female pilot before all of a sudden we see a swarm of small robots racing towards us. And here is where I make a brief mention about something in this game that's to get all the more noticeable later on, and that is the performance. You may remember the previous game ran at a pretty consistent 60 fields per second. Well, achieving that is something of a luxury here. In lower stress scenarios you'll generally be fine, but in situations where you've got all of these enemies here, you're going to be hoping that some semblance of frame rate comes back. For now though, we have to deal with all of those enemies using the plethora of abilities at our disposal, before we make our way to the first boss, another orbital frame, piloted by that woman we saw in the cutscene earlier. Our Jet is a pretty interesting boss and works quite well as an introduction to some of this game's mechanics, such as dashing quickly. But given how I played this game a fair bit, it's fair to say that I utterly destroyed this boss. After giving her a stern warning, we ask her who her commander is, but since she's keeping quiet about the whole thing, we are forced to go upstairs as it were and have a look around an enemy ship, where we deal with a collection of enemies. I'll cover the enemy variety when it's appropriate, but for now I'll say that I'm already digging this. The game introduces you quickly to the grabbing mechanic, which is something you'll need for an encounter coming pretty much now, as we see an orbital frame with a vaguely familiar design descend from some device. It sounds familiar too, but with a rather heavily distorted yet recognisable voice. She's a very quick and difficult opponent, but using the modified grabbing mechanics to our advantage, we skewer the enemy to the wall. Oh god no, it's Viola. It's now that we recognise that it's Viola. Sort of. This isn't a good sign because she's become an AI with her cold, aggressive personality. But before we can think about that, Jehuty begins to resonate with Anubis. We move to a new room to see what's going on, before Anubis shows up out of nowhere. Anubis is actively impossible to beat here, as it is far in advance of what we're able to work with. We're at a significant disadvantage on account of not having fireballs, a teleporting move, and a pretty much impenetrable shield. We're eventually smashed to submission and grabbed by the scruff of our neck. Anubis finally has his way with Jehuty, whilst the pilots finally figure out who one another is. Anubis then throws Jehuty to Nephthys, who shouldn't even be here. But she's gonna do to us what we did to her. Following this, a discussion in a corridor happens between the two, but not before the pilot of our jet decides to punch us for some reason. Dingo and Anubis' pilot, Noman, decide to have a heart-to-heart in which Noman tries to bring Dingo back into Bahram after he left years ago. But clearly disillusioned from past experiences, he ardently refuses. He is then shot 4 times. Noman leaves, satisfied that Dingo won't survive, and tells the female pilot to clean up after this. She takes a deep breath, approaches Dingo, and explains that she wants to help him. All the while Dingo makes rather unfortunate faces, but given the situation, that can't really be helped. Dingo isn't dead yet, it would seem. The pilot gives some doctors a few instructions, and they work to make Dingo into something of a cyborg. They plug him into Jehuty's cockpit, where all of a sudden, he is overcome by a wave of energy that awakens him. After a couple interrogatories Dingo fires towards the pilot, she mentions how Dingo is now, in effect, symbiotically linked to Jehuty. Dingo cannot survive outside of it. Keen to test this, he stands up and almost leaves the cockpit, before almost going into cardiac arrest. Sitting down, more interrogatories get thrown around before it's revealed the pilot isn't from Bahram, but is in fact a spy from the Space Force called Ken Marineris. Dingo is not at all convinced by this, but plays along with it for now, since he's basically stuck in a corner. We're still on the battleship, circling the Martian moon Deimos, but our goal is to find a way off the ship and onto Mars. We make our way out the hangar we occupy to encounter a distress signal from a Space Force pilot called Taper. We respond incognito, and Taper instructs us that he's in a shipping container, and we have the job of finding out which container he is in. Now I'll go into greater detail about sections like these later, but suffice it to say, you need to know what to look for. In this instance, Taper will drop a few hints about which container to look for, and if you think you have the right container, shoot it. If you're wrong, you'll just have to go to another room and try again, which happened quite a few times for me. You will eventually find Taper, cowering and scared at the sheer scale of Jehuty, and tries to get back inside of his box. You'll convince him to get out though, and you'll both have the mission of getting off of the ship via the emergency shooter. He also gives you the sub-weapon Geyser. I'll also cover these a little later on when the time is appropriate, but for now we have a mission on our hands. We pick him up and take him with us throughout the bowels of the ship. We have to use the map to be able to know where we're going, so once we look at the map, we determine the best course of action to get to the shooter. This is basically an escort mission in which you have to avoid damaging Taper, but as far as escort missions go, this is relatively inoffensive. Whilst Taper can't really do anything, and you can damage Taper by accident, you do at least get the opportunity to wreck a whole bunch of Cyclops and Raptors. And hey, I can't say no to that. So as we get to the shooter, Taper is getting a little inquisitive, but because of perfect timing, enemies prepare to pour in as Taper prepares his escape via the shooter. We stay behind for a moment however, leading to an encounter with some enemies. This time however, they arrive as a troop with a commander. These guys are actually quite tough and have a routine as far as their attacks go. The procedure for dealing with these guys tends to be a matter of destroying the commander and then everyone else. I tend not to do that though. Don't ask me why, I guess I'm just under the impression that I get more out of it by going about it the hard way. But whatever, we have 2 sets of these enemies and we deal with them promptly. We then sense an AI controlled orbital frame is on its way towards us, believing it to be Viola. Perhaps understandably unwilling to battle someone who was once a combat body revived as a monster, Dingo powers Jehuty up to propel itself towards Mars. We find ourselves in Margaritafa, and upon planetfall, Ken tries to instruct us on what to do, but so agape at the destruction around the place, Dingo interrupts and asks for something of a history lesson. The long and short of it is Bahram have had their way with Mars, gaining control of all of its military worth. The Space Force tried to bust through Visalia County where Barham are largely based, but suffered significant losses. There is a device that could turn the tables in the Space Force's favour, however. The Vector Cannon. Briefly mentioned by Taper earlier, to gloss over how it works because physics is not entirely convinced by it, it is to be used to burst through the defences of Aumaan, the Barham military fortress. Our chat is cut short, however, as Jehuty picks up a signal warning of an unknown entity. In the distance, a flash of light, and then a jet of sorts appears, before transforming into a robot. Our business card of beating the shit out of anything that appears to be obstructing us gets taken most kindly by the enemy, and this is where I want to talk about the game's structure. The previous game was a bit disjointed in how it handled its objectives. It's a linear game, but you're given a few hotspots to investigate, which resulted in an amount of backtracking which made playing the game feel like a chore after a while. One of the major differences the sequel makes is the removal of the open-ended navigation, and in its place is a more structured linear game, guiding you through set piece after set piece, as opposed to the superfluous MacGuffin hunt the previous game fetishizes. Because of this structure, it enables it to have more varied, interesting boss fights, with this battle against Vic Viper being quite interesting, as it's one of the few examples of crossovers in this game. Gradius, anyone? In any event, we battle Vic Viper until we defeat it and force it to hold fast. The pilot tells us to abandon Jehuty, but we refuse. Ada recognises the voice, and it's Leo Stenbuck? The kid from the first game? Yeah, in a move akin to the likes of Amuro Ray, Noriko Takaya and Simone, Leo has become something of a hot-headed badass with his own fancy machine. Props to the lad. Conversation breaks out with Leo warning Dingo about Jehuty's purpose. Jehuty, once it reaches Aumaan, is intended to be used as a bomb to destroy Aumaan and it in the process. It's a suicide mission. Dingo tries to argue with a machine whilst Leo tries to butt in to advise that he take Jehuty, but Dingo refuses and sort of manages to knock a bit of sense into Ada for the moment, and convinces Leo that he's fine and can be trusted, resulting in Leo giving us a new sub-weapon, Gauntlet. A plan comes along for Jehuty to burst into Visalia County, and to try and worm through what isn't yet destroyed to reach Aumaan. We tried to make our move, and we got more enemies to fight because we needed a new obstacle. After dealing with all of them, we make our way into a gorge, and into what's possibly the most open part of this game. We have a gate that's closed off, and we need to blow up 2 generators to open it up. There's a generator at the end of each arm of the gorge, with the gorge itself containing a whole host of hazards that we must destroy, like mosquitoes, mummy heads, raptors, cyclops, and the like. We deal with both the generators, get a new sub-weapon called Phalanx, and unlock the gate that will enable us to get to Visalia County proper. However, we sense something might be up, and... Oh lord, is that a meteor? Oh, okay, never mind, it's just the Viola AI popping up because, boss time! So the idea is she will charge at you every now and again, so you must guard using an object you pick up, and once she's stunned, cut her up and you should be golden. It's a fairly simple encounter, and did you actually think it would be finished that easily? She decides she wants to grapple with us and busts through a wall, leading us to an area in what appears to be a city. We're pinned against an electric fence of sorts which damages anything that comes into contact with it. You can probably figure out what to do from here, as you got the gauntlet from Leo just a minute ago, and you can make great use of that as a means of pushing enemies away from you. Very effective, I must say. We destroy Viola and inherit another sub-weapon, this being Comet. Shortly after, Taper reinitiates contact with you, but moments later, spiders start to pour in from the woodwork and the Space Force units are in combat with them. Taper gets a little bit confused when you tell him to get his friends back under control, and after contacting someone else in the squad, they become rather annoyed about a foreign element getting involved. Dingo then instructs Ada to assist in clearing out all the spiders and displays all the buildings in the area and how many occupants remain. You can see where this is going if you played the first game. Here we have the first of only 2 SOS situations where your performance is given a grade at the end. The job is simple: eliminate the spiders before they and the Space Force Levs can cause havoc and raise the city. I am honestly glad that these set-piece moments are more varied than in the previous game. They make them all the more compelling, especially when situations are as varied as they are here, and we'll see that in a moment. Soon after, we get our grade, and hey, an A! Not bad, certainly better than blowing up the church in the last game. The guy who got especially antsy at us for getting involved gets the good old patented dingo kidney slap, after he points out that had he not gotten involved, the problem would have been far worse. He then shuts up. Taper gets back in contact with us, but then we now have a train on course to Ayers Cliff, and it's got a few of Barham's guys in tow. We have little choice but to pursue it. This train has a few heavily defended carriages which need to be destroyed in order to progress. There is a problem, however. There is a timer. The timer gets more and more stringent on higher difficulties, and actually this is probably as good a time as any to talk about the difficulty. If there's one weird thing that I've noticed about this game in comparison to the original, it's how much harder it is. That difficulty will come into play quite a bit later on account of this version being Japanese, but how do I explain this? Let's take Zone of the Ender's difficulty curve, assuming the normal difficulty setting is selected. It starts out fairly easy, but as you get through more things, it gets a tad trickier. As for Zone of the Ender's the second runner, the game's difficulty starts pretty much where the previous game left off. As we progress through the game, of course, this kind of problem becomes all the more apparent, partly because of the language barrier, but that's for when the time comes. Anyhow, it's about time that we destroyed this train. Most of this is handled by using the dash lasers, and some of our sub-weapons can come in quite handy here, with Gauntlet being very effective at pushing enemies towards the walls of the tunnel, and seeing fall all the way back behind the train is quite the source of amusement. This is also one of those times where the music changes when you're close to completing the objective. In fact, I'm going to talk about the music in this game now, and you know something? This game has, without question, one of my favourite soundtracks in any game ever made. Period. The original game's soundtrack was largely pleasant sounding with a few fairly notable tracks, primarily the boss battle music and the opening song Kiss Me Sunlights. On the whole, however, it was a soundtrack that was designed to fit the atmosphere of the game, but not really to set off the imagination or really to make you want to blast it on your stereo. Good, but somewhat forgettable. The second runner soundtrack, much like every other part of this game, takes what the previous one did, trimmed what was unnecessary, made the good bits even better and augmented it with some more experimental sounds. The game's opening theme, Beyond the Bounds, is unique in how it uses vocalese for some parts of the song, with the vocalese itself being largely inspired by the Finnish language. It's a track that gets the blood pumping 100%. The train sequence is also a favourite because it has an almost locomotive sounding beat to it. It's hard for me to describe because I don't really follow music theory, but it fits the idea of catching up with a train only to blow it up quite well. And rest assured, there are many more excellent pieces in the soundtrack as we play through the game. For now, however, we managed to derail the train and stop it in its tracks. Time for us to move on to Ayers Cliff. Oh, and we get a new sub-weapon called Decoy, which allows us to plant a projection of ourselves to trick enemies. Ken decides to harass us again, explaining that she's now on Mars, and an aura of distrust and suspicion between Dingo and Ken comes full swing, with Dingo still refusing to buy into Ken's story of being a spy, whilst Ken herself talks about how Dingo abandoned his crew to hide out on Callisto. Interrupted by Taper, Dingo hangs up on her and comes into contact with another Space Force Lev pilot. However, the Levs are suddenly accosted by an unknown party. You make it to your destination at the power station on Ayers Cliff, but all that's present are the remains of near enough a dozen Levs, all destroyed with no signs of life. You proceed through a hole and into the power station itself.
Oh hi Viola, didn't expect to see you here.
This encounter is particularly difficult. You're faced with a new enemy called the Clod, which has a tendency to dish out the old grabby hands treatment. It's essentially if a mummy head was a wrestler instead of whatever comparison you want to draw for a mummy head. Not only that, but you also have Viola using a very similar moveset to what she had been using in an earlier encounter. With that in mind, the idea here is to grab a clod, somehow, and defend with it and force Viola to bash into it and stun her. Alternatively, the other strat of using Gauntlet on her works wonders as a means of dealing damage whilst she has her shield up. We eventually make short work of her and we end up getting a new sub-weapon, and a particularly potent one at that. Vector Cannon. We have a conversation with Ada about how Viola was incredibly fierce and one of those people you never want to cross swords with on the battlefield. Taper, realising what was being said, finally gets suspicious of Dingo and throws out some interrogatories. Ken then hovers over onto the scene to see what the commotion is about, but while Ken's back is turned from Viola, she leaves a parting gift in the form of a virus infecting Ken's R-Jet, making it move entirely out of Ken's control. The only way for it to be nullified is by using Jehuty to grab a hold of R-Jet when it's stunned, so that we can work the virus out of R-Jet's system somehow. Not entirely sure how that's supposed to work, but sci-fi's gonna sci-fi, I guess. This throws us into a part of the game that used to be a source of great disdain for me. I don't dislike it as much as I used to, but this part of the game does require you to be especially careful. R-Jet will use a plethora of moves, much like the original encounter with her, such as the wisps and the laser attack. You want to close in on her and parry her close range attacks by attacking her with just the right timing. Do it a few times and she'll be open to being grabbed. Grab her and the AI will slowly be deleted. Every now and again, R-Jet will be damaged for seemingly no reason, as if this encounter wasn't tricky enough to manage as it was already. She won't lose health in that manner from the final quarter down, however, but be careful all the same. We do manage to avoid accidentally killing her, but if it were any more clutch, it would have stalled. We defeat the AI and make our way out of the slowly disintegrating power station, but Ken is not able to move. Dingo, not above returning the favour, teases Ken, but as Ken suddenly falls further down the tower, he gives chase. She's perched on a ledge, just about, and gives us another sub-weapon, Wisp. There isn't a time limit for us, thankfully, to get out of here, but we do need to destroy a few enemies before we can progress in some parts. We make our way out, and Dingo and Ken once again have a conversation. Agreeing that it would be unwise to continue with a robot that cannot be controlled, Ken gets out of R-Jet and jumps into the cockpit of Jehuty to ride alongside Dingo. We're still not strong enough to deal with Anubis, but Dingo knows somebody who might have something that could turn the tides a bit. We decide to head on over to somebody called Lloyd and see if he can help in some way. Dingo also explains what happened to him in his final Barham mission, in working to deliver a whole bunch of Metatron to Antilia Colony. A troop of Space Force soldiers surrounded them, however, and ended up destroying the entire unit, leaving Dingo as the sole survivor in a unit that was sold out. Ken tries to argue that he could have gone back to Barham and started an uprising, but considering how Noman reacted when Dingo refused to return beside him, that wouldn't have worked. In any event, we have to cut the conversation short as, well, we need to find our way around a literal minefield here. Lloyd seems like an overprotective and especially paranoid fellow. Automated weapons systems designed to go off if you stray off the beaten path, in an attempt to enact even a tinge of freedom, infest the place. As such, we have to navigate our way around all these problems. Now that's all grand and dandy, but how do we know where to go? There's no markings anywhere. Well, it's time for me to explain one particular thing with this game, and how comparatively unfriendly it is for people who don't know any Japanese. With this in mind, I will go back to the first game to set a record straight. I neglected to mention how suitable it is as far as Japanese language requirements are concerned. I'd posit that whilst you won't really understand much of the story at all, for the most part the game doesn't require any Japanese for you to beat it. You may stumble near the end as far as understanding what to do with the bombs and the spaceport, but besides that, I'm struggling to think of any instance that would necessitate the player understanding, really, any Japanese. I suppose this kind of benefits the game's open-ended design, as you could simply get by going all over the place to see if you missed something. Not an ideal solution, but it's something. By comparison, Zone of the Enders: The Second Runner requires a little bit more than what the original game asks of you. Earlier on in the taper rescue mission, you're asked to look for a container, but if you don't know the numbers or even colours in Japanese, you're already in a difficult place. And as for the Arja AI situation, would anyone have really been able to work out how to do the boss fight all that easily, without reading and listening to what the game tells you on how to defeat it? I'd argue not. I only know because of how often I've played this game already. With that in mind, this situation requires us to understand 4 particular expressions: Hidari, Migi, Sukoshi, and Matte. Hidari means left, Migi means right, Sukoshi means little, and Matte means wait or stop. For example, when Ken says, she is instructing you to turn a little bit left, and when she says, while you are moving, stop where you are moving and await further instruction on where to go. This will prove especially important later on, but for now, you have to move through this place with quite a bit of caution. Along the way we had to fight a few battles, one of which lands us a new sub-weapon, Halberd. You also have a couple situations where you have to guard or avoid locking onto a bomb, lest it ends up seeking you out. It's quite the interesting situation, but it doesn't outstay its welcome before we're done and moving on to the next part. Lloyd contacts us and greets us, aware of the fact that Dingo is wanting something to improve Jehuty's performance. He invites Dingo to the basement of his home. In any other circumstance we'd walk right away because that's just creepy. Here, however, we accept since there's just no other alternative. We move towards the factory area and are greeted with some new enemies to contend with. And right now I'm going to talk about the enemy variety, because it is a pretty key thing in this game's brilliance. The original game relied on making the most out of 3 particular types of enemy with a couple of modifiers, which gave them slightly different behaviours depending on level and designation. It was okay, but it was definitely a simplistic move made in an effort to make the most out of few resources. There are plenty of enemies, but they all consisted of the same 3 specific types, which got boring fairly quickly. Zone of the Enders: The Second Runner bumps up the enemy variety significantly. Aside from your usual raptors, mummy heads and cyclops, you now have spiders, naritas, leopardos, sailors, mosquitoes and clods, all affected by levels and all with their unique traits. This is far more interesting to work with, as you've got a bunch of different enemies to contend with that all work in different ways. Spiders have a shield that you need to use geysers on to deactivate and expose them, whilst Naritas can transform and move quickly towards you. The enemy variety in this game is simply excellent in my opinion. You've got some really cool mech designs here, and when combined with the frenetic combat this game offers, you can't help but have a hell of a time. If I had to criticise the enemy variety, I'd probably say that some of the more interesting varieties tend not to appear at some points where you may expect them to, such as the Leopardos, but despite that I don't really have much of an issue with it. Anyhow, we work our way through the factory going in and out of buildings via freight elevators, making this one of the few areas in the game that gives you a sense of scale. We find ourselves underground with a whole series of I don't know what. Pistons, pylons, control rods for an RBMK reactor that are tipped with graphite because the Soviet Union are cheapskates. In any event, these are a genuine hazard, or a pretty useful weapon if you can coax an enemy in between them as they shut. It's rather amusing to see that happen. That being said, the camera becomes your enemy in this situation due to how claustrophobic the design is in this place. Perhaps I should make mention of the game's presentation. The original Zone of the Enders featured some pretty decent graphics for a game that released very early in the PlayStation 2's lifespan, but didn't exactly break the mould in terms of presentation. The cutscenes, for example, looked pretty awkward insofar as having an aged 3D anime look, which doesn't hold up anymore. The direction of those cutscenes was also a touch iffy. It felt unsure of itself because of how all over the place the composition was for the cutscenes. Zone of the Enders: The Second Runner improves things drastically in that regard. Cutscenes are a combination of in-engine 3D combined with 2D anime, animated by Gonzo, who are notable for their work on series such as Full Metal Panic, Hellsing and Chrono Crusade. Conversations are once again handled from within the cockpit of Jehuty, but rather than a voice without something to look at, you've generally got talking heads showing up on the screen, similarly animated in 2D. The look of this game is far more palatable compared to the original, as the graphics engine as well got a bit of modification to it by way of the cel shading on models, as well as some particularly stunning effects. Despite not being technically amazing, it's one of the better looking games on the PS2 in terms of visual cohesion. Anyway, this is where things get a little bit interesting. You finally enter a massive chamber, with Lloyd present in his rather large robot with an interesting hat on. He goes on to explain that both Jehuty and Anubis are essentially equal, with Jehuty lacking one rather important thing that Lloyd could provide. He isn't finished with his challenge, however, as he reveals that his loyalty to Noman prevents him from assisting you further. As a result, the pair of you enter combat in one of the more unusual boss fights in this game. Inhert is very agile and impervious to many things, but getting close to it and using Geyser or Gauntlet or something should enable you to start dealing damage to it. I never really did figure out a decent strategy for taking this guy on, as opposed to just approaching it and smacking it a bit. But after Inhert reaches half its health, the boss battle changes. Dramatically. Inhert manages to turn out the lights and cloaks everything in absolute darkness. During this phase, you have to move in the direction of the lock-on target. Ada will then count down as a marker for how far away you are from Inhert. During this, attacks will come flying your way and you have to react to them accordingly. For missiles, you have to use your guard. For the F-mine, you just have to move in whichever direction you can, and Ada will sometimes tell you to move in a given direction to avoid an attack as well. And this is where things get weird. You know how earlier we had to navigate what was essentially a series of defences and that it required instruction on the part of Ken to accomplish it? Well, this game being in Japanese already makes it quite tricky for someone who doesn't have the best comprehension of it. This particular situation is difficult. Very difficult. If you don't know Japanese and can't easily pick up on it, you're basically without a hope in hell. You're given a relatively little time to react, and if you need to think about what you need to do, you're going to get hit. It's also surprisingly easy to get left and right the wrong way round when you go to a different language. You'd think left, right, hidari, migi, sinister, dexter, you'd think it'd be something simple. Oh, how I wish that was the case. I spent a stupid amount of time on this boss. Almost 40 minutes in fact. If this were a speedrun, one would have to assume that the current world record was held by a snail on Valiant. It's a battle that I genuinely grew to dislike on account of my trying to adjust to Japanese instruction, but whatever, we eventually deal with this old codger. We eventually get a new soap weapon called Homing Missile. This will be pretty useful in time to come. We touch ground now that Lloyd yields and decides to give you the program that you need to become an equal to Anubis. The problem, however, is that it takes a little while to bake into the system, meaning it will be unusable for some time. Oh, speak of the devil. Ken jumps into the cockpit of Inhert to shield herself from the debris falling from the ceiling, and we finally get the Zero Shift program, which needs some time to work itself into the system, just as Noman decides to be a party crasher. Noman talks with Dingo briefly about the Metatron suicide mission, and breaking the news that the pair of them are currently controlling the fruits of that labour. The Metatron from that mission was turned into both Anubis and Jehuty. Dingo, realising he's piloting something that came from his fellow soldiers dying, falls into a fit of controlled rage, whilst Noman goads him into a fight. And naturally, we oblige. Much like the first battle with Anubis, this fight is unwinnable. You simply have to survive and do enough damage that the game will allow you to escape. Lloyd will open up an exit that will allow you to get out of the chamber. Anubis throws its lance but just about misses us. He then approaches Inhert and pulls its head off and destroys it. Wait, wasn't Ken in there? Well, the ghost of Inhert departs away from us for now and we move on, before we are contacted by— oh, it's Ken! She tells Dingo to keep on going and to stop Aumaan no matter what, and talks as though the two of them are friends, which, given the conversations that went on from the start onwards, yeah, sure, whatever. She abruptly hangs up before Ada assures us that she should be fine. Leo then calls us moments later and says that a whole battalion of Levs are on their way to the canyon outside of the entrance of Aumaan in preparation for a major offensive. Dingo decides he'll go over there and do what he can, but before he can continue, he is alerted to the presence of an armada of battleships headed in the direction of the canyon. We have no choice but to destroy the entire armada. In order to destroy the ships, we have to destroy each ship's engine with the use of the vector cannon, which takes a moment to charge up, but once it activates, it will make sure work of atomizing whatever comes into contact with it. So now that we have this objective, why don't I talk about a couple of things. This game, much like the previous, utilises a level system. Every kill you score gets you experience points, and each level increases your maximum health and sub-energy count. Now I specifically mention sub-energy because the game changes the sub-weapon system from the previous game to unify ammunition into a basic pool, with more potent weapons consuming more sub-energy, which can be replenished by destroying enemies and collecting sub-energy pickups. The sub-weapons have been made all the more useful too. Whilst I used a couple in the previous game, I couldn't tell you which ones I used without referring to the footage that I recorded. I can say, however, that I used Gauntlet, Wisp, Geyser and Homing Missile reasonably frequently during this game. The new systems at play in this game make the sub-weapons a lot more enjoyable to use. Geyser to bind enemies in place, Wisp to draw enemies to you, which allows you to grab them and swing them, Homing Missiles for when the dash shots aren't enough. Perhaps on the surface it doesn't look like much, but the rebalancing of the sub-weapon system has enabled it to play far better than the previous game. The original game wasn't bad necessarily with regards to its weapons system, but this is much better. I haven't really talked about the battle here because it's fairly simple. You have a few ships to blow up, and in order to make it easier on yourself, blow up as much as you can around it, and avoid the massive laser beams fired from the ships. The charging sequence for the vector cannon is pretty long, but the payoff? Well, I think it speaks for itself. We have now dealt with all of the ships and... wait, there's another one? Or rather, there's a big golden ball? Here we jump straight into another encounter, this time with Zakat. If you wanted to see how this game would look as a Danmaku shooter, imagine this, but with just a few more lasers fired at increased frequency. The battle consists of two phases, the first consisting of simply whacking the big weird machine whilst it shoots a bunch of lasers at you. It will occasionally pop a shield, but you can disarm it easily enough. The second phase is a bit different, as Zakat transforms into something a bit more crustacean-like, but with a load of panels orbiting it. It does some things like generating aerial bombs or just starting a big old light show. That is until it becomes the light show after we blow it up and force its occupants to abandon ship, but before it goes completely kaput, we're assaulted with another sub-weapon, Floating Mine. Whilst we head over to the canyon, Ken manages to pop out of a pile of rubble, but Noman stands over her and takes her captive. Once we hit the canyon, we find ourselves suddenly subject to a firing squad from the Space Force. Taper appears to have spilled the beans on who Dingo is, and in doing so, somebody gets in contact with us, Elena Weinberg. She requests that we surrender Jehuty. After telling her we followed orders from a Space Force spy, she doesn't recognise who we referred to in Ken. Leo intervenes and tries to defuse the situation, and Dingo begins to argue with the Levs in explaining that whilst he was once with Bahram, he's not fighting in their favour, and whilst technically enemies, they have a common goal in reaching Aumaan. Although if they still want to shoot him, they can take aim. Fortunately, nobody obliges. Everyone, now rallied with Jehuty, gets going towards the crevice and to engage the enemy head on. And this is one of my favourite sequences in the game, because it's chaotic, bombastic, and fraught with peril from all sides, a tone that is met like for like by the game's soundtrack. You're fighting an honest-to-God war here. You're instructed to make the best use of your sub-weapons here, with the use of Geyser being especially important in preventing enemies from overwhelming the Levs. There is one problem with this battle, however. The performance is abysmal. Due to the sheer mayhem going on all over the place, the game is practically forcing itself to run at a slower speed. This problem crops up a fair few times throughout the game, of course, but at no point does it reach the same level that it's at here. Never has the game run with such a degree of slowdown for several minutes, and yet this situation is among one of my favourites in the game. The unbridled bedlam here is simply spectacular, and even though it takes a while to complete, owing to both the slowdown and sheer quantity of enemies, it's such a thrill. At the end, our performance is graded. I did quite well to get an A, I think. Now that we've done that, what's going on with Jehuty? Zero Shift! It's finally installed and ready to use, and in doing so has given Jehuty a massive performance boost, as we will see shortly. For now though, we head on down into the crevice and make our way down towards Aumaan. Now we've got a monster of a machine on our hands. We're able to slice and dice through every single enemy we see, now that we have a huge improvement of performance in Jehuty. Zero Shift enables us to teleport almost instantly towards what we're locked onto. Your dash lasers are also more numerous and more powerful, and the ability to charge and fire off burst shots without fear of losing the charge from slightly damaging attacks. My love for this mech is indescribable. Jehuty V2 is one of my favourite mechs in any media. It's up there with the likes of Big O, Turn A Gundam and Eva Unit 1. It is simply incredible, and I can't believe how difficult it is to find any sort of model kit for it. In any event, as we make progress, Ken manages to make contact with us as we head ever further down, telling us she's at Aumaan, and that she indeed lied about her being a spy from the Space Force. She also reveals that her father was a soldier and that he died on Callisto in a mission, likely in the same mission Dingo himself was the sole survivor in. Ken warns us not to come any closer to Aumaan, but we are left without much of a choice. And we're left with even less of a choice as Noman shows up to hold a gun up to Ken's head and warns us that he's waiting. We, with limited options, oblige him. After a few more battles, we make our way into a tunnel with some sort of shockwave system in place, one that does tremendous damage if you don't use something to guard yourself with. Getting to the end of the tunnel, we have to blow up the generator wall so that we can get by. We find a gate sealed with compressed space, requiring that we use the vector cannon. Just as we find it, Leo shows up to give us a hand. The vector cannon charges, and once it is at capacity, we allow it to fire and penetrate a hole in the defences of Aumaan. Finally, we are at our destination. Or are we? Things don't seem quite right here. Indeed, Dingo and Ada recognise as much. It's supposedly a control facility for Aumaan, rather than being Aumaan itself, but before we can do anything with that information, Noman shows up gagging for a fight. The battle rages on, and it's surprisingly easy. Compared to the previous two encounters with Anubis, this seems almost like child's play, and we're not even particularly damaged either because Anubis' attacks simply aren't up to scratch. Dingo realises that something is amiss, but Leo, acting in haste, gives Anubis a massive gut punch and heavily damages it. Look behind you. Turns out it was a fake Anubis all along, and now that that realisation has sunk in, so will all the wounds Leo sustains from being pummeled by the real Anubis. We stare at the fake Anubis and realise that Ken is occupying the cockpit, because we needed to ensure that Noman was enough of a dick to ensure that his hostages were always at risk of death. Anubis proceeds to tear down the ceiling, and Ken explains to Dingo that not only is Aumaan not where we are at right now, but that it is indeed the control facility for it, and that Aumaan itself is on the moon of Phobos. The hole in the ceiling now becomes something of an elevator whose pole brings up the damaged fake Anubis with Ken as its occupant, the damaged Vic Viper with Leo as its occupant, and the damaged Jehuty with Dingo, us, as its occupant. We are now riding along in the compressed space tunnel towards Phobos. Jehuty is damaged substantially, with us losing all but one of our sub-weapons, that being Zero Shift, and having some limitations as far as our attack arsenal is concerned. Nonetheless, we soldier forth to do battle with Anubis. We have a notable disadvantage in terms of attack potential, but us having Zero Shift does at least make us have some chance of beating Anubis. Anubis now is much closer to the level of difficulty it had in the first two encounters with it, and is not to be trifled with. Whilst Inherit was difficult in terms of requiring the understanding of certain terms in Japanese, Anubis here is a battle of skill, and by God is it a battle. You have the music in the background providing the battle with a genuine sense of significance. Noman's voice lines goading you to take him on, Anubis' moveset to give you a bit of a memory test to see if you know what to look for, and it all adds up to make this a battle I really enjoy. We deliver the smackdown on Anubis and send it flying off into space. Jehuty begins to take on a newer appearance as well, and we retrieve Ken and Leo and make sure that they're alive and as well as can be. We alert Elena to having our people in need of evac. Elena reminds us that Jehuty has a program built within its systems to activate a self-destruct system should Jehuty enter the core of Aumaan. After trying and failing to convince Elena to remove it, we get a feeling of something. Anubis, suddenly, crash lands onto the surface of Phobos, clearly in no state to battle. We approach Anubis, but before we can land the final killing blow, Noman manages to blow open a massive crevice and falls down it, in no uncertain terms daring us to follow. Elena tells us, in sci-fi-ese, that Aumaan has the ability to effectively atomize the entire solar system, not just Mars. Because of this, Elena requests that we destroy Aumaan to ensure this does not happen. Dingo uses this as an opportunity to bargain with the Space Force, and requests that Earth leaves Mars alone should Dingo succeed, and Elena accepts. Dingo then talks with Ken for a moment before entering battle once more. Multiple copies of Nephthys start to pour out of the crevice, and we are left with the choice of either fighting these enemies ad infinitum or following Anubis down into the crevice. And here we are, Aumaan, the final battle against Anubis, and for whatever reason the battle here is, I won't say easy, but not quite the difficulty that the previous battles were at. I know it's damaged, but it's a tad disappointing for a final boss. That being said, the setup for it as a final boss is not all that bad. The environment is utter chaos, and to say that this game has some serious performance problems, it handles this part of the game as though basically nothing was happening. Anubis here works a bit more defensively than in previous battles, probably owing to it having less of a chance of winning if it just went on an all-out offensive. It does, however, throw the occasional unblockable and highly damaging fireball attack, so caution is very much advised. If you manage the previous battles in the game, however, this should not prove massively difficult. The only real trouble that you will likely have is getting an attack in, what with Anubis' defensive posture. But in spite of that, it should be relatively smooth. And so it was that we completely immobilized Anubis. Pausing for effect with the blade to Anubis' head, Dingo tells Noman that his ignoble arse is headed straight for the firing squad of Dingo's fallen comrades. And then, the killing blow lands. Suddenly, however, Aumaan activates and begins charging. Ada, with no other option, begins Jehuty's self-destruct sequence in an attempt to destroy Aumaan before it is too late. Leo tries to break through Aumaan's growing sphere of destruction, but to no avail. Dingo prepares to break through Aumaan itself, the light of which can be seen far away. Jehuty breaks through Aumaan, but Leo in his Vic Viper is propelled some distance away, and Jehuty sustains significant damage before a piercing silence comes about. Jehuty floats seemingly in an abyss, whilst the head and upper torso of the now destroyed Anubis floats towards Jehuty. Almost by instinct, Jehuty touches Anubis, and Dingo has a massive realisation of what he could do. Without a moment of hesitation, Dingo throws the torso of Anubis towards Aumaan. He then hotspots it out of there and grabs Leo to make sure he can get out of the blast zone. Aumaan starts to weaken, its presence shrinking until finally it detonates and explodes, with Mars losing one of its moons in the process. But what of Dingo and Leo? What happened to them? In the distance, Ken sees something. She spots a damaged orbital frame approaching her, with another machine in tow. She rushes the fake Anubis towards it, with Jehuty's arms breaking off, leaving Dingo and Ken in an embrace, before stowing aboard a Space Force vessel. Everyone is alive and well. Ken instructs Leo to call for medical personnel to assist in getting Dingo out of the cockpit, and Leo recognises Ada, with Dingo explaining that if Jehuty and Anubis are the same at a material level, then it would stand to reason that using Anubis would be enough to stop Aumaan. Medics arrive and pull Dingo from the cockpit of Jehuty. Dingo then requests to have his old body back, citing that his current one is a bit too big. Perhaps out of relief that he's alright after all of what's happened, Ken embraces him. Dingo is then carted off, and credits. Zone of the Enders: The Second Runner is one of my favourite games of all time, and is in my opinion the platonic ideal of a sequel. It's what I immediately think of when it comes to games that improve on their predecessor. Whilst the original game was pretty good, it's fair to say that its lasting impact wasn't tremendous. It did spawn a briefly lasting media franchise during the 2000s, but it was not massively successful in that regard. I bring this up because the original Zone of the Enders released in unusual times with unusual circumstances behind it. It had a demo of the highly anticipated Metal Gear Solid 2, for example, and that was able to back it up. Zone of the Enders: The Second Runner had no such luxury. It had to stand on its own 2 feet, and it didn't do so well at first. It made even at the very least, but it being a sequel to a game many probably forgot, in place of another, likely affected its success. In spite of this, however, it is the game in the series that has seen the most releases, largely because of its higher quality and because of its higher production value compared to the first game. So before I talk about those, allow me to sum up by saying that I think it's one of the best games ever made, and despite its technical issues, the orgy of sight, sound and interactivity is what makes it, and I want people to try this game out. Wholeheartedly recommend it. Which version of the game to play, however? Well, that's a funny one really, because there are 4 distinct versions of the game that you can get. The first is the version that I played, which is the standard version of the game. What you saw is what you got with this version. In Europe, however, the PAL release is labelled Special Edition, hence why it took some time for the game to launch. The Special Edition would also release in Japan as Anubis Zone of the Enders Special Edition, featuring a whole slew of additions. Some gameplay sequences were modified to showcase enemies with extra scenarios available in the game, as well as a CD soundtrack. With the exception of the PS2 releases, there is a Gen 7 release of the game. Zone of the Enders HD Collection features both main games but with a bump in resolution, and some assets being improved for a high definition package for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. It also came with a demo for Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, in the West at least, almost like a throwback. The ports were handled by High Voltage Software, notable for games such as LEGO Racers and The Conduit. Unfortunately, as ports go, the HD collection did not live up to expectation, with the second runner suffering from several problems and glitches, which, when combined with the already present performance issues, makes it rather unattractive as a package. Things would improve, however, as Japan-based developers Hexadrive would work on providing the game with a patch to make the second runner play far better than before. There is, however, a caveat to this update. It's specifically for the second runner, meaning the first game has no such changes, and is only available for the PlayStation 3, not the Xbox 360. The improvements made are significant and the game almost runs flawlessly now. If you asked me at launch if this was the best way to play the game, I would say I don't know because I'd never played the PS2 original up to that point. But I would say, if you ask me now, that it is a good way to play the game. There is one more way, however. At Tokyo Game Show 2017, Konami announced that Zone of the Enders: The Second Runner would be getting a remaster, yet again, but this time with some extra, more exciting features than the previous versions. Releasing 1 year later for the PlayStation 4 and Microsoft Windows, interestingly, Zone of the Enders: The Second Runner Mars bumps up the resolution to 4K, runs at a consistent 60 FPS, features improved visuals all around, and features a seemingly novel, fully implemented VR mode. Yep, you heard that correctly, VR mode. I haven't given this a shot yet, but I certainly wouldn't mind giving it a go because, well, I don't have to worry about setting this thing up. Been playing through Half-Life Alyx recently. Bloody brilliant. This is probably the best version of the game on a technical level. Konami genuinely worked to make this version as good as it could be, and who knows, maybe it might lead somewhere. Of course, this is Konami and I'm not expecting anything, but you never know. A third entry in the series was planned by Hideo Kojima, but Konami prevented him from pursuing it until after all major projects were over. But Konami was shuffling about the place, meaning he couldn't get any work done on a prospective Zone of the Enders 3. After the relatively poor reception of Zone of the Enders HD Collection, combined with the technical difficulties that arose in developing it, it was confirmed that the project had been scrapped, and the franchise has now gone without a brand new installment for over 15 years. Although I have my gripes and criticisms with Konami, owing to their treatment of Kojima, the flagrant disregard for their past, pursuing and lobbying in favour of gambling in Japan, and several other things that they've done in the past decade, I don't like to see companies like this fall from grace, especially after as many highs as Konami have had. I could fill my entire library with Konami's games. Silent Hill, Metal Gear Solid, Zone of the Enders, Castlevania,
Silent Hill,
you name it, and I'll try and make a video on it. Simply out of love for their games, and in the hope that they can at least release something worthwhile every now and again. This has been Daniel Learmouth, and for as long-winded as this video has been, my love for the game is difficult to shrink down into a relatively digestible format, hence why this video is as long as it is. Long form's hard. If you have any ideas of what I should cover, let me know, and I'll see what I can do. I also have my VG Collect list in the description if you want a better idea of what I have in my library at this time. For now though, this has been Daniel Learmouth. Z.O.E.